let me say thank you very much for the warm welcome, and it's lovely to be among so many Aboriginal friends, and I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders, Aboriginal people in the room, and to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land. I've been formally out of employment in housing for 12 months, so I may be wildly out of date, but it's emboldening not to actually be in an institution apart from having a visiting association with the University of New South Wales, where I was for 8 years before I retired. And I've been, I suppose I've been drawn back in because it's an exciting time in housing. As was mentioned earlier, there are changes at the national level, not least national leadership around addressing housing, and I think that there are opportunities, albeit they're not as big or as straightforward as we might like them to be. There are opportunities. So what I'm going to do today, the session was challenges for overcoming the lack of growth, if you like, in social housing. So I'm just going to put out some bold ideas. They're loose, they're not fully developed, but they may catalyse an ongoing discussion and momentum in this sector, which is certainly what my ambition is. So as a sort of a tipping off point to acknowledge what the challenges are, and this is just one page of some very well-known challenges that I think I'm trying in the rest of the talk to address, is that we know we have a massive supply shortfall in the provision of secure, affordable and appropriate low-cost housing. And it's no wonder, if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, apart from anything else, this tells you why governments are absolutely indictable about the problem that we have today. The red line is what's happened to the growth of the Australian population and Australian households. So it's increased from 6 million households to 10 million households over 25 years. What has happened to social housing over the 25 years? It's completely flatlined. So we are trying, that's the blue line. Not only is it tiny, it's almost impossible to put it on a graph of the same scale, but it is completely flatlined. So this gap is growing, and of course we're all the victims of that, in the sense of how do we do more with less, how do we ration, how do we make scarce dollars go farther by changing the product, you know, it's less secure, there's less choice and so forth. That is an indictable problem that we have across the whole system. And not only that is, and I'll make some exceptions for what's emerging at the moment through the Treasurer, which I think we should all embrace as a very positive direction, there's been an absolute lack of leadership in this space. A brief period in the late 2000s when Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan and Tanya Plibersek made housing a huge priority in a new government. But apart from that, really, Canberra's been pushing back. There's not a problem. And we have a really poor vision for the sector. The vision is to deter people from social housing or to house people in the private rental market. I mean, we know the failings of the private rental market and how inadequate it is for our clients. So we really can't accept the current vision for the system. That's one of the challenges. And we have, to the extent that there are initiatives, they're fragmented, they're short-term, they don't speak to each other. Very uncoordinated policy. I mean, somebody said Australia doesn't have a housing policy, and there's truth in that statement. More specifically for this sector, so these are big challenges. More specifically for this sector, we've seen an increasing move to mainstreaming and top-down approaches, all part of the rationing of the resources and keeping the system as much in control as possible. There is so much more energy and diversity and potential out there if we tried bottom up, and particularly in this community, and I'll make some suggestions about that. We've seen the loss of tied funding and identified funding, and it's a debatable point whether that's a good thing because it was a minimum, or whether it's a bad thing because every dollar now has to be fought for by this subsector. And certainly so far, and I think Neil's point about regulation is critical here, the Aboriginal community housing sector hasn't been able to compete for mainstream funds. Have a look how many Aboriginal organisations received National Rental Affordability Scheme allocations. I think it was 2. We've got the capacity issues I just mentioned. And I think another issue when we come and focus on development and supply as a way of addressing this gap, and a very critical part of it, and that's all I want to talk about today, is supply and real growth in this sector to meet Aboriginal need. We've got major planning system barriers. I was at a talk recently of a land council that documented the incredible difficulties they'd had in developing some of their land and the years and years that had passed, and nobody had taken responsibility to enable that development to happen. That's first step when you're trying to develop new housing. So they're the challenges, but I'm going to now become a bit more upbeat. So I'm not going to try and address how systemically we might change that, but I do want to bring a lens to this from this sector's point of view as to how it might get involved in turning around the ship in terms of increasing social housing supply. As I said, it's high level. I don't have an answer that is anywhere within the ballpark of the quantum of the problem, but it may be a positive direction. And it emphasises leverage and working together and working across funding options and funding sources. And I'll talk about three things, and I've got three or four slides to match. How we plan for growth, how we finance growth, and how we deliver growth. So how do we plan for growth? Well, the first thing is we really need an explicit plan. And what comes to mind from my experience here is the plan that community housing had in New South Wales called Planning for the Future in 2008-9, I think it was. And Planning for the Future is known to everybody as 13 to 30. And it was how community housing could take itself from 13,000 dwellings in New South Wales as it was then to 30,000 dwellings. And it was bold, and that's a lot of growth. And we put it out there, we put a lot of work behind it, we didn't know it could be delivered, and it was delivered short of its 10-year horizon. It was delivered in 5 years. Now, happenstance things happen, but it had power in and of itself as a message. It was an attractor of investment, and it showed the sector had confidence in itself. So I think a plan to grow is a really important thing, and I've been thinking about what your particular shorthand for that could be, and I was thinking 5 by 500, 5 years of 500 dwellings, and then I looked at the numbers and I thought, that's probably impossible. 9,000 to 10,000, you're 9,000 now if you combine AHO and AHCP. Let's go to 10% increase in 5 years. It's better than at the moment we're at steady state, that flat line. Or maybe doubling every year, so 50 in the first year, 100 in the next year, 200 in the next year. But we can play with that, and you can come back to what is our vision that we're prepared to sort of get behind and make work. I think the second thing about the plan I really want to emphasise, I mean, obviously it needs to be needs-driven. At the moment, what happens is funding-driven. Funding is earmarked for a certain initiative. That's where the money goes. It doesn't necessarily meet the highest need or the mix of needs, or is it proportionate to need? So the work that you've been seeing in this conference about needs is really critical. Targets are really critical. That's what the message, the big headline message is. 5 by 500, that's the target. The plans have to be built top down within a framework and a set of rules and a set of constraints, and then bottom up. Every community's got something to contribute to that target, and only the local community knows what the mix of possibilities are there that will maximise their contribution to the target. So I would really encourage a process that starts with a framework and that builds bottom up in a cascading way to say, here, in an additive sense, in an additionality sense, is how we're going to get to that target. That will reduce the fragmentation of effort. That will reduce the competition for resources and put people on a collaborative, we can do this together. And it will promote leverage, because in every community there will be different local opportunities, whether they're corporate opportunities, whether they're land, whether they're a fund that government puts into that community but not another community that can be leveraged into housing. For example, a lovely project I know in South Australia which built 100 homes, leveraged in the Regional Development Fund, and that was the key to scaling up that project. It might get local government resources. They might be small, but they might make the difference to the contribution to that target. So we need a plan, and we need targets, and we need everyone engaged in contributing to the plan, and we need to leverage resources beyond those we know at the moment. How are we going to finance this growth? Well, the model that's going around and the model that the sector needs to embrace is not a model where government pays for all the housing, because unfortunately, and because of what we've seen in terms of the long-term neglect of this space by governments, there is not a capital growth fund for housing. And to the extent that there is one in the future, it's likely to be quite small, and we're going to have to think very hard about how to use it. So we do need to look to other sources of funds. We do need to look to private financing. We do need to look to blending subsidies. This makes our task harder, more complex. It's not necessarily more cost effective, but it's the world we live in. It is actually helpful to think about how are we going to fund the construction of these houses when they don't have any revenue and when land costs so much, and how are we going to fund the operation of these houses when we do have revenue. We do have subsidies like CRA, and up until recently we had a very valuable subsidy called the National Rental Affordability Scheme. So one of the things is to think about how to get the financing support for the construction phase, which might be quite different to the operating phase, and there's a lot of analysis of that in the bigger story around the way that the community housing sector is going ahead at the moment. And I'll sort of come back to some of that perhaps. So I've just put my brain to what's around and what could we do with it that might be different and that might add up to more than 50 houses a year, which I think is the current productivity that the AHO is able to generate. Well, first of all, the AHO itself is a party to the National Affordable Housing Agreement and its successor from next year, the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement. It has an asset base of nearly 5,000 dwellings of some considerable value. It has been a custodian of Napari, and there may be a successor to Napari in some form that it can partake in. What could it do with this differently instead of perhaps just building or purchasing housing? One of the things it could do to that model to kick-start development is it could have a construction loan fund. So to get your houses built, you could borrow from the AHO and pay it back when they're built and when you're able to finance debt, because you've then got a lender into the project. So it could have a construction fund. That's worked a treat in an example I could go into in the ACT for a community housing organisation. That money comes back and it revolves again and again, so it doesn't get lost to the system. It could densify its sites, take a leaf out of the mainstream book, identify all of its assets that have potential for much greater yield and prioritise the redevelopment of those. And I'm sure the AHO is doing these things, but I just want to put them together and show you that it can add up. It could have a fund for accessory dwellings on existing sites, or it could have a fund for adding rooms to dwellings. We've got this terrible overcrowding problem. We can't afford to build enough new houses. Adding a room, adding an accessory dwelling may be a cost-effective way of getting some quick capacity there. And of course, if it transfers the stock, which is planned, to the Aboriginal community housing providers to build their scale, there's also a potential there to leverage more growth off that. Now, the mainstream model is the wrong path to go down. The mainstream model in New South Wales involves no ambition to leverage additional supply off the transferred housing. It's all about service improvement and tenant and client outcomes. I think it's absolutely critical in the Aboriginal housing sector that leveraging supply off transferred stock is a key priority. The second thing is we've had a social and affordable housing fund in New South Wales, 2 tranches. Terrific idea because it offers long-term operating subsidy that helps meet that long-term debt in the operating phase, among other things. Why haven't we got a SAF Aboriginal? There is so much Aboriginal land out there that could be developed. If once it's developed, because you don't have to pay for the land, you have your rolling construction fund, it starts to operate and there's an operating subsidy to pay the debt. Perfect, works great. Let's advocate for a special purpose SAF for Aboriginal landholders. Cross-subsidy from market sales, a number of the land councils are onto this. You can do developments like a mainstream developer and you can sell some of the development and you can reinvest in your communities. This is happening in the community housing sector. Every project I've looked at lately has an element of cross-subsidy in it, which reduces long-term debt, it brings in profit, and the pre-sales, say to a builder or something, help to actually make the project viable. Push more into the public housing redevelopment programs, Communities Plus. There should be a target in those programs for housing to be managed and delivered in the Aboriginal community, or for long leases, or the sale of some of the housing from the private providers in those programs at cost to the Aboriginal housing sector. The bond aggregator. The bond aggregator is the magic word of the moment. It came out of our research. Its aim is to pool the demand for finance from small organisations, among other things, its aim is this, so that collectively they have better buying power in the finance market and therefore can get more cost-effective debt, not the very high rates of debt with the very restrictive covenants that are currently coming from the banks. So how is the HC Aboriginal community housing sector going to participate in the bond aggregator? That's probably a few years away because I think the sector is too small and fragmented for lenders at the moment, but it's something to engage with now and to have a real plan for when you might seize that opportunity. Just in the metropolitan area, the Greater Sydney Commission and Urban Growth are going to hold significant funds raised from the redevelopment of masses of corridors of Sydney, fees contributed by developers for affordable housing. How is the AHO going to capture some of those funds in Sydney and ensure that their share of those can be available for growth in this sector? That's an important question. And another one, which is very specialised in terms of the accommodation output, but which can help to boost the business of an organisation, is tapping into the capital fund, which is quite a generous fund for NDIS clients with special housing needs. One of the tricks in this is having, if you're going to become a developer organisation and you're going to be involved in contributing to growth in housing supply over time, is you've got to be able to have enough in your pipeline to maintain your business, maintain your expertise, for it to be a going concern. So looking to multiple sources of funding to support that is very important. Now, all of those are hard, all of those aren't there yet. I've said feasible, but I think, you know, with the right push and the right advocacy and the right evidence behind it and everybody's participation to show what can be leveraged, more of those things could come to pass and contribute to the growth target we're trying to achieve. So what does it mean in terms of delivery? Well, possibly there's a role for some more specialist organisations in your sector that bring together capacity. One of those might be a development organisation. I think there's been some talk about that. Maybe there should also be a centralised trust fund. I quite like this idea because funding comes from so many disparate sources and usually it's not big enough to match to an expensive project development. So maybe we need to pool funds and then have a decision-making process to reallocate those funds. That would be something you could do, for example, with the developer contributions through a trust. More development partnerships with CHPs. This is about CHPs providing services to you, but it's also about you getting benefit by perhaps purchasing or long leasing some things from their developments. Joining the consortia that bid for the things that are around so that the Aboriginal organisations become normally part of these consortia in the same way that it's been normalised that CHPs are part of the consortia. If you look at Communities Plus, you have to have a CHP partner. You could say you have to have an ACHP partner as well in the consortia. It's just a matter of will. Getting yourselves more skilled around development and financing as Aboriginal community organisations by appointing expert directors, or perhaps a subcommittee which is specialised in just catalysing your development business. And above all in this, I think there's a very proactive role for the AHO in brokering these deals, getting the SAF up, you know, getting agreement around more diverse use of some of the funds that they have, and resolving some of the barriers, like the planning barriers and so on. The AHO is your voice, your advocate in government. And if you have a plan and you're all in it together, then they can take it forward within government and play their part in that regard. I think that's all. So that was meant to be energising, and I'm sure there'll be lots to debate from it. Thank you.